Paul Newman revealed the 7 most evil people in Hollywood history. The blue eyes could stare right through you. For decades, Paul Newman's piercing gaze captivated audiences on screen. But few knew that those same eyes had witnessed the darker machinery of Hollywood. The power players and predators who operated behind the glamorous facade. Paul saw it all but said very little publicly, revealed a longtime friend who worked alongside Newman for over 20 years. He kept a mental list of the people he considered genuinely corrupt, not just difficult personalities or demanding artists, but those he believed had truly abused their power and harmed others without consequence. Unlike many stars who arrived in Hollywood naive and unprepared, Newman entered the system with his eyes wide open. His later start in the industry, arriving in his late 20s after military service and formal training, gave him a perspective most young actors lacked. He observed the machinery of Hollywood with the detached clarity of someone who had already seen the darker sides of human behavior. Tonight, we reveal the 7 figures who earned places on Newman's private list of Hollywood's most corrupt and damaging personalities, the power players and performers whose behavior behind closed doors revealed the industry's darkest truths. But first, we need to understand the system that enabled such abuse, and the man who perhaps more than anyone else established a template for how unchecked power could corrupt an entire industry for generations.
Our hemisphere in flames, unoffending nations crushed beneath the engines of destruction.
Louis B. Mayer, the godfather of control. When Paul Newman arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, the legendary grip of Louis B. Mayer over MGM was already beginning to loosen. But the system Mayer had built, and the methods he had pioneered for controlling talent, remained firmly entrenched throughout the industry. Called one of the most powerful and most feared men in Golden Age Hollywood, noted film historian Mark Harris, who interviewed Newman about the studio era. Newman had a particular contempt for Mayer, not just because of specific actions, but because he saw him as the architect of a system designed to exploit vulnerable people while maintaining a public image of wholesome family entertainment. While Mayer had created what was often called more stars than the heavens, his methods for managing those stars revealed a darker pattern that particularly disturbed Newman, the systematic emotional manipulation of young actresses who found themselves trapped in a system that controlled every aspect of their lives. Known for emotional blackmail, abusive control of actresses, and studio cover-ups, explained a film archivist who cataloged Newman's rare interviews about Hollywood history. Paul was especially disturbed by how Mayer would position himself as a father figure to young women under contract, creating dependent relationships he could then exploit for studio purposes. These controlling relationships extended far beyond normal professional boundaries. Mayer and his team dictated actresses' weights, romantic relationships, and even reproductive choices. Stars like Judy Garland were given amphetamines to control their weight and barbiturates to help them sleep, creating addiction issues that would plague them for life. He made stars and broke souls, Newman reportedly told a co-star during the filming of The Silver Chalice in 1954. The comment came after hearing about Judy Garland's ongoing struggles. The co-star later revealed, Paul was horrified by how the studio had managed her since childhood, seeing it not as unfortunate side effects, but as systematic abuse disguised as star-making. What particularly disturbed Newman about Mayer was the calculated nature of his control systems. This wasn't simply a difficult boss with a temper, but the architect of an entire methodology for identifying, developing, and exploiting talent while maintaining complete control over their public and private lives. Mayer created what Newman called industrial-scale exploitation, said a colleague who worked with Newman during the 1960s. Paul believed that Mayer's real innovation wasn't in filmmaking, but in developing systems to identify vulnerable young people, especially women, and creating structures that made them totally dependent on the studio's approval. That blueprint continued long after Mayer himself had left MGM. This system extended beyond emotional control to active cover-ups of potentially damaging incidents involving stars. The infamous MGM fixers would handle everything from hiding sexual assaults to managing unwanted pregnancies to paying off potential scandals, all to protect the studio's investments and maintain its family-friendly image. Newman's assessment of Mayer wasn't based on personal interaction, but on what he considered the poisonous legacy of Mayer's approach to power, a model that influenced how subsequent generations of Hollywood leaders would view their relationship with talent. Harry Cohn, the dictator of Columbia. If Louis B. Mayer represented institutional control disguised as paternalistic care, Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures displayed a more nakedly authoritarian approach to power that Newman found equally disturbing but for different reasons. Ran Columbia like a dictator, observed director Sidney Pollack, who discussed the studio system extensively with Newman while working together. Paul had this theory about power in Hollywood, that it revealed who people truly were by removing normal constraints on behavior. In Cohn, he saw someone who didn't even pretend to disguise his worst impulses once he achieved control. Cohn's approach to running Columbia became legendary for its combination of surveillance, intimidation, and retribution against anyone who challenged his authority. Unlike Mayer's more calculated manipulation, Cohn's methods involved direct fear and humiliation, including a notorious system of microphones hidden throughout the studio to spy on employees. Use surveillance, threats, and intimidation to control talent, said a film historian who documented Newman's occasional public comments about Hollywood's history. Newman was particularly disturbed by how Cohn would deliberately humiliate actors and directors in front of others, a public breaking of spirit that Paul saw as revealing something fundamentally sadistic in Cohn's character. This sadistic tendency wasn't merely a management style, but seemed to reflect a genuine pleasure in exercising destructive power. Cohn became known for playing actors against each other, making promises he had no intention of keeping, and deliberately fostering an environment of fear and uncertainty throughout Columbia Pictures. He didn't just ruin careers, he enjoyed it, Newman reportedly commented after hearing stories about Cohn's treatment of Rita Hayworth, one of Columbia's biggest stars. Paul was struck by how Cohn seemed to take personal satisfaction in controlling Hayworth's life, changing her name, her hair color, even pushing her into a marriage that advanced Cohn's business interests rather than her happiness. What distinguished Cohn in Newman's assessment was not just the abuse of power, but the apparent pleasure taken in wielding it destructively, a quality Newman found particularly revealing of character. Where some studio heads could justify their controlling behavior as necessary for business, Cohn's obvious enjoyment of dominance suggested something darker. Newman believed you could judge people by whether power corrupted them or merely revealed them, explained a longtime friend of the actor. With Cohn, Paul saw power as simply removing the mask, exposing the bullying, insecure personality that had likely always been there but was now unleashed by his position at Columbia. The legacy of Cohn's approach extended beyond his personal behavior to establishing a management culture that tolerated abuse throughout the studio system. By normalizing surveillance, intimidation, and public humiliation as acceptable leadership tools, Cohn helped establish patterns that would be difficult to break even decades after his death.
It takes us approximately 2 years to produce a CinemaScope picture. That means that when the film is released to the public, trends and...
Darryl F. Zanuck, Power and Predation. During Hollywood's golden age, the infamous casting couch was often treated as an open secret, an unfortunate but supposedly inevitable aspect of the entertainment industry. For Paul Newman, this normalization of sexual coercion represented one of Hollywood's most fundamental moral failures, and no figure embodied this abuse more clearly than 20th Century Fox head Darryl F. Zanuck. Accused of using the casting couch system for decades, noted a film scholar who documented accounts of studio system abuses. Newman saw Zanuck not just as participating in a problematic system, but as one of its most enthusiastic architects, someone who had built dedicated infrastructure for sexual exploitation right into the professional operations of a major studio. Zanuck's approach was remarkably systematic. He reportedly blocked off 30-minute slots in his daily calendar for sexual encounters with aspiring actresses, treating these coercive interactions as routine business appointments. This scheduling practice particularly disturbed Newman, who saw it as revealing the calculated nature of behavior often excused as momentary weakness. Newman reportedly despised how Zanuck treated women, said a writer who interviewed several actresses from the studio era. What Paul found especially revealing was how Zanuck's behavior continued long after he had established himself as one of Hollywood's most powerful figures. This wasn't about temptation or opportunity, it was about deliberately using professional power as leverage for sexual access. This pattern extended throughout Zanuck's long career, with accounts of his predatory behavior spanning from the 1930s through the 1960s. The consistency and duration of these actions indicated not isolated incidents, but a fundamental approach to power that Newman found deeply revealing of character. He thought power gave him permission. It didn't, Newman reportedly told a co-star after hearing about Zanuck's treatment of a young actress who had been promised a role in exchange for sexual compliance. Paul believed there was a special place in hell for men who deliberately created professional barriers they could then offer to remove in exchange for sexual access. What particularly concerned Newman about figures like Zanuck was how their behavior established patterns that became institutionalized throughout the industry. By normalizing sexual coercion as an expected aspect of the career path for actresses, they created damage that extended far beyond their individual actions. Newman saw Zanuck as establishing a template that poisoned Hollywood for generations, explained a director who discussed industry history with Newman. It wasn't just about individual victims, though that was bad enough. It was about creating an entire professional environment where exploitation was built into the system itself, where women were forced to make impossible choices between their dignity and their careers. This systemic perspective informed Newman's assessment of figures like Zanuck. While some might view the casting couch as an unfortunate product of its time, Newman recognized it as a deliberate abuse of power that reflected fundamental character flaws in those who perpetuated and institutionalized it.
Couple of snifters and I got the feeling kind of wild. Can't you take a joke?
Wallace Beery, the monster behind the smile. Unlike the studio heads who wielded institutional power, actor Wallace Beery represented a different kind of Hollywood corruption. The star, whose on-screen persona of lovable gruffness masked what Newman considered a genuinely dangerous personality protected by studio influence. Allegedly, beat a man to death in a cover-up involving MGM fixers, said a film historian who documented Newman's occasional references to Hollywood's darker history. What disturbed Paul about the Beery case wasn't just the alleged violence itself, but how effectively the studio system could hide even the most serious crimes when committed by valuable talent. The incident in question, a hit-and-run death that was allegedly covered up by MGM's infamous fixer, Eddie Mannix, represented for Newman a perfect example of how Hollywood's protection systems corrupted not just the industry, but the broader application of justice. When studios could effectively place their stars above the law, the consequences extended far beyond Hollywood itself. Known on set as a bully, racist, and abuser, noted a writer who interviewed crew members from Beery's era. Newman was particularly struck by the gap between Beery's public image in films like The Champ and the experiences of those who actually worked with him. That contrast between the manufactured persona and the real behavior exemplified what Paul saw as Hollywood's most fundamental dishonesty. This dishonesty extended beyond public relations to active enablement of harmful behavior. Crew members who worked with Beery reported consistent patterns of verbal abuse, racism toward non-white workers, and a volatile temper that occasionally escalated to physical intimidation, all of which was tolerated because of his value as a box office draw. People smiled when the camera rolled, but behind it, they flinched, Newman reportedly commented after hearing stories about Beery's on-set behavior from an older crew member. Paul believed this pattern of public charm masking private cruelty revealed something fundamentally disturbing about not just Beery, but the system that protected and enabled him. What particularly concerned Newman about figures like Beery was how their protection by studios taught dangerous lessons about accountability throughout the industry. When stars could behave abhorrently without consequences, it established precedents that would be followed by subsequent generations of powerful figures. Newman saw in Beery the beginning of a pattern that would continue throughout Hollywood history, explained a colleague who worked with Newman during the 1960s. The star whose commercial value insulates them from normal consequences. The publicity machine that constructs likable personas to mask troubling private behavior. The system that prioritizes protecting investments over protecting vulnerable people. This pattern of protection and enablement represented for Newman one of Hollywood's most corrosive influences on American culture, teaching the public that fame and commercial value could and should place certain individuals beyond normal accountability, a lesson with implications extending far beyond the entertainment industry.
When I do Laid Back and Cool with you.
Really?
Yeah, last time we did the show, I was laid back and cool, and people write...
Jerry Lewis, Cruelty Behind Comedy. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Jerry Lewis was emerging as one of Hollywood's most powerful comedic figures, not just as a performer, but increasingly as a director with complete control over his productions. It was this transition from performer to power player that revealed aspects of Lewis's personality that Newman found deeply troubling. Newman reportedly loathed Lewis's off-camera cruelty and arrogance, said a crew member who worked on productions involving both men. Paul had this fundamental belief that you could judge people's character by how they treated those with less power. On that scale, what he observed of Lewis's behavior toward crew members, particularly those who couldn't fight back, revealed something Newman found genuinely disturbing. Lewis's sets became notorious for his treatment of workers, verbal abuse directed at crew members, public humiliation of assistants, and an overall environment of fear where his volatile moods dominated the production atmosphere. For Newman, this behavior wasn't just unprofessional, but revealed a fundamental character issue. Accused of bullying crew, gaslighting co-stars, and exploiting women, noted a film historian who documented accounts from Lewis's productions. Newman was particularly bothered by how Lewis would alternate between periods of charm and moments of cruelty, creating an unpredictable environment where people never knew which version they would encounter. This unpredictability extended to Lewis's treatment of his co-stars, including his former partner Dean Martin. People who worked with the pair reported that Lewis would sometimes deliberately undermine Martin during their collaborations, then portray himself as the victim when discussing their eventual split. He hid behind comedy, but what he did wasn't funny, Newman reportedly told a director who had worked with Lewis. This comment came after hearing how Lewis had reduced a young production assistant to tears over a minor mistake, then immediately shifted into his comedic persona when more influential people entered the room, a pattern Newman found particularly revealing. What distinguished Lewis in Newman's assessment wasn't just difficult behavior, but a pattern of specifically targeting those with less power while maintaining a completely different persona with those who could advance or harm his career. This calculated nature of the abuse suggested not just a bad temper, but a deliberate approach to using and misusing power. Newman believed that comedy should punch up, not down, explained a writer who worked with Newman. He saw Lewis as consistently punching down, using his growing power to hurt people who couldn't fight back, then hiding behind both his comedic persona and his considerable talent when called to account. As Lewis gained more control as a director, these tendencies reportedly intensified. His sets became known for their oppressive atmosphere, with crew members describing a culture of fear where Lewis's approval or displeasure could make or break not just the day, but potentially one's entire career within the industry.
Down my Twitter in cold blood.
But you either get out of town or you get the same thing as he got.
Errol Flynn, The Dangerous Charm. Few Hollywood figures embodied the gap between public persona and private reality more dramatically than Errol Flynn. His swashbuckling charm made him one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars, but behind that dashing image lay behavior that Newman considered not merely problematic, but actively dangerous. Charismatic on screen, but Newman viewed him as dangerously reckless and predatory, said a film historian familiar with Newman's occasional comments about Hollywood's past. Paul made an important distinction between stars who were simply difficult or demanding and those who posed genuine threats to others. In Flynn, he saw someone whose behavior went far beyond normal celebrity excess into territory that should have triggered serious intervention. Flynn's history included allegations of sexual assault, including charges of statutory rape involving 2 underage girls in 1942. Though he was acquitted in a trial that became a media sensation, the pattern of behavior described by multiple accusers over years suggested something more systematic than isolated incidents. Accused of rape had ties to fascist sympathizers, noted a researcher who documented Flynn's controversial history. Newman was disturbed not just by the specific allegations, but by the broader pattern they revealed. Someone who seemingly viewed other people, particularly women, as commodities to be used rather than individuals deserving basic dignity and respect. This pattern extended beyond sexual misconduct to other disturbing associations. Flynn's expressions of admiration for Hitler and fascist ideology, while sometimes dismissed as provocative talk rather than genuine conviction, troubled Newman as revealing something fundamental about Flynn's character and values. He wasn't a rogue, he was a threat, Newman reportedly commented after discussing Flynn's history with an older actor who had worked with him. Paul made a distinction that was important to him between stars whose bad behavior primarily harmed themselves and those who systematically harmed others. Flynn fell firmly into the second category in Newman's assessment. What particularly concerned Newman was how Flynn's charm and commercial value had insulated him from consequences that might have protected potential victims. The studio's investment in Flynn's image created a shield that allowed problematic behavior to continue far longer than it might have without institutional protection. Newman saw in Flynn a perfect example of the studio system's moral failure, explained a colleague who knew Newman's views on Hollywood history. When commercial considerations consistently outweighed basic ethical responsibilities, the result was not just individual injustice, but a system that taught powerful men they could act with impunity as long as they remained profitable. This systemic perspective informed Newman's view of figures like Flynn, seeing them not as isolated bad apples, but as symptoms of a broader industry culture that prioritized profit and image over safety and accountability, with consequences that extended far beyond any individual career.
Producer comes to Los Angeles from New York to break into the movie business.
Roy Radin, Hollywood's Darkest Corner. As the studio system gave way to a more fragmented entertainment industry in the 1970s and 80s, new kinds of power players emerged, including independent producers and financiers who operated with even less oversight than the old studio heads. For Newman, producer Roy Radin represented the logical endpoint of a system where money trumped morality. Tied to the Cotton Club murder and accused of sexual violence, noted a journalist who covered Hollywood's darker side during this period, Newman saw in Radin something particularly disturbing, not the institutional corruption of the studio era, but a new kind of freelance predator attracted to the industry precisely because of its moral flexibility and potential for exploitation. Radin's history included allegations of drugging and sexually assaulting women at his parties, events that mixed entertainment, business networking, and what some described as deliberately orchestrated opportunities for abuse. This pattern suggested not opportunistic exploitation, but a systematic approach to using Hollywood connections as a mechanism for predation. Newman considered him a symptom of how far Hollywood had fallen, explained a director who discussed the industry's evolution with Newman. Paul believed that while the studio system had many deep problems, it at least operated within certain boundaries of public respectability. He saw figures like Radin as representing a new phase where even those minimal constraints had disappeared. This evolution culminated in Radin's involvement in what became known as the Cotton Club murder, a case that exposed connections between Hollywood financing, organized crime, and violence that shocked even industry insiders familiar with the business's darker aspects. He was the ghost of everything rotten underneath the surface, Newman reportedly commented after Radin's murder in 1983. The remark reflected Paul's concern that Hollywood's moral compromises had created an environment where someone like Radin didn't represent an anomaly, but a logical extension of the industry's willingness to overlook character issues when money was involved. What particularly disturbed Newman about the Radin case was how it exposed the thin line between Hollywood's legitimate business operations and organized crime, a connection that had existed since the industry's earliest days but became increasingly visible during this period of independent financing and production. Newman saw Radin as representing the culmination of decades of moral compromise, said a colleague familiar with Newman's thinking. After generations of prioritizing profit over ethics, the industry had created an environment where even someone with Radin's history could operate openly, with access to legitimate projects, talent, and distribution channels. This systematic perspective characterized Newman's assessment of Hollywood's darker figures, seeing them not as aberrations, but as predictable products of an environment that consistently valued commercial success over character, talent over ethics, and image over reality. As we reflect on Newman's private assessments of Hollywood's most troubling figures, a pattern emerges that reveals as much about Newman himself as about the subjects of his concern. Throughout his career, Newman maintained a clear-eyed perspective on the industry that made him famous, recognizing its creative potential while refusing to ignore its darker realities. Paul understood Hollywood's duality better than most, observed director Sidney Pollack, who worked closely with Newman on multiple films. He could appreciate the art while seeing the corruption, love the creative process while recognizing the exploitation. That ability to hold both truths simultaneously gave him a moral clarity that was rare in the industry. This clarity informed not just Newman's judgments about Hollywood's past, but his own approach to working within the system. As his power and influence grew, he deliberately established alternative models, creating production environments known for their professionalism and respect, using his celebrity to advance causes beyond his personal gain, and mentoring younger performers on navigating the industry without moral compromise. Newman's list of Hollywood's most corrupt figures wasn't just about judging others, explained a longtime friend of the actor. It was about identifying patterns he was determined not to repeat. Each of these negative examples informed his own choices about how to use power responsibly, how to treat collaborators with dignity, and how to measure success beyond commercial metrics. This approach extended to Newman's famous philanthropic work, which many close to him saw as directly connected to his assessment of Hollywood's moral failures. By establishing the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang camp for seriously ill children and creating the Newman's Own food company that donated all profits to charity, he offered an alternative model for how celebrity and influence could be directed toward genuinely beneficial ends. Paul believed power revealed character, said a colleague who worked with Newman on his charitable initiatives. He saw how the unchecked power of Hollywood had revealed the worst in certain people, and he was determined that whatever power came his way would reveal something different, would be channeled toward helping those who couldn't help themselves, rather than exploiting vulnerability for personal gain. This determination to chart a different course made Newman not just a successful actor, but an important moral counterexample within an industry often lacking clear ethical frameworks. While never claiming perfect virtue for himself, he established both professional and philanthropic practices that demonstrated the possibility of working within Hollywood while maintaining core principles. The most powerful legacy of Newman's clear-eyed assessment of Hollywood's darker figures may be how it informed his own choices, creating a career defined not just by successful films, but by a consistent demonstration that alternative approaches were possible even within a deeply flawed system. In identifying what he considered Hollywood's worst, Newman helped define and demonstrate its best potential. If you found this exploration illuminating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more examinations of Hollywood's complex history. Share your thoughts in the comments about other aspects of classic Hollywood you'd like us to explore in future videos. Remember that understanding the full context of entertainment history, including its troubling aspects, helps us appreciate the positive changes that have occurred while recognizing how much work remains to be done in creating truly ethical creative industries.